Sir Keir Starmer's political honeymoon has come to an abrupt and dramatic end. Barely 5 months after leading Labour to a historic landslide victory, his government is already reeling from plummeting approval ratings, public frustration, and a series of escalating crises. What was once a shining moment for the Labour Party has turned into a nightmare as key policies spark outrage among voters, and trust in Starmer's leadership continues to erode. At the same time, Nigel Farage, the firebrand of British politics, is staging a remarkable comeback, capitalising on Labour's failings and channeling the growing anger across the nation. For Labour, the stakes could not be higher. Starmer's leadership is under siege, and the fight for political survival has already begun. The cracks began to show almost immediately after Starmer took office. Labour's landslide gave the party a commanding 174-seat majority, but was achieved with just 33.7% of the vote share, a number that left Labour vulnerable to the kind of swift backlash it now faces. According to a damning Ipsos poll, 2/3 of Britons feel worse off under Labour's leadership, a devastating statistic for a government elected on promises of hope and change. Polling expert Sir John Curtis has called Labour's decline in public support unprecedented, noting that no government in modern history has faced such a rapid collapse in popularity. At the centre of the storm is a policy decision that has sparked outrage nationwide: the means testing of winter fuel payments. Previously universal, the benefit is now restricted to pensioners claiming pension credit, cutting millions off from financial aid they've relied on for decades. The government argues the policy is necessary to save £1.5 billion annually and stabilise public finances. But critics warn it will push over 100,000 elderly Britons into poverty by 2026, fueling anger among one of the most politically active voting blocs. The backlash has been swift and severe. Pensioners feel betrayed, and emotional stories of elderly people being forced to choose between heating and food during a brutal winter have dominated headlines. Starmer, during a bruising round of BBC interviews, was grilled on why his government seemed to be targeting the elderly during a cost-of-living crisis. His justification, that Labour inherited a broken economy and has no choice but to make difficult decisions, has done little to calm the storm. Critics argue that Labour's approach is tone-deaf, prioritising fiscal responsibility over protecting the vulnerable and alienating a key segment of its voter base in the process. As pensioners protest in the streets, Labour faces another rebellion, this time from farmers. Thousands of farmers recently staged a mass protest in London over proposed changes to inheritance tax and the phasing out of EU-era agricultural subsidies. Farmers warn that Labour's policies will devastate family farms, forcing many out of business and accelerating the decline of rural Britain. The government insists that the majority of farms will be unaffected, but rural communities see the changes as yet another betrayal by an urban-focused leadership. The farmers' revolt has only deepened the perception that Labour is disconnected from everyday Britons. This narrative is being exploited by Nigel Farage, who is positioning himself as the voice of those disillusioned by Labour's policies. Farage, once dismissed as a relic of the Brexit era, has re-emerged as a formidable force in British politics. His Reform UK party is gaining traction among voters who feel abandoned by mainstream politics. Farage's fiery rhetoric against the elitist establishment has struck a chord with those who see Labour as prioritising metropolitan elites over ordinary people. Farage's resurgence is a direct response to Labour's failures. Reform UK's approval ratings are steadily climbing, and Farage himself has seen a notable boost in his favourability. For a growing number of voters, Farage represents the alternative to a political establishment they feel has let them down. Political analysts note that Farage's rise is not just a rejection of Labour, but a reflection of a deeper dissatisfaction with the entire political system. Labour's internal struggles are compounding the external challenges. The party has failed to articulate a clear and compelling narrative to justify its decisions. Voters are increasingly frustrated by what they perceive as a lack of direction and purpose. Sir John Curtis points out that Labour's primary defence, that the Tories left the country in economic ruins, rings hollow with an electorate hungry for solutions. Without a cohesive story to explain its actions, Labour risks losing the trust of a public that is growing impatient for results. In an attempt to regain control of the narrative, Labour introduced respect orders, a revamped version of the infamous ASPOs aimed at tackling antisocial behaviour. The policy, which includes severe penalties such as 2-year jail terms for persistent offenders, was designed to show that Labour is tough on crime. However, the rollout has been marred by controversy. Civil liberties groups have slammed the measure as draconian, warning that it risks criminalising vulnerable populations such as the homeless. Even some Labour MPs have expressed doubts about the policy, questioning its effectiveness and the message it sends to voters. The backlash to respect orders is emblematic of Labour's broader struggles. Every attempt to shift the narrative seems to backfire, reinforcing the perception that the government is reactive rather than proactive. For voters, the cumulative effect of these controversies is devastating. Labour, which campaigned on promises of hope and renewal, is increasingly viewed as a party mired in missteps and unable to deliver on its promises. Farage, meanwhile, is thriving in this environment. His speeches, laced with populist fervour, have drawn large crowds and reignited the passions of voters who feel abandoned by mainstream politics. Farage's message is simple, but effective. Labour is failing, and Reform UK offers a real alternative. His growing influence is a direct threat to Labour's dominance and a reminder of how quickly political fortunes can shift. For Starmer, the road ahead is fraught with peril. With years left until the next general election, Labour is banking on the hope that time will heal the wounds of its early missteps. The government is pointing to long-term plans to fix the NHS, grow the economy, and reduce inflation as evidence that it is laying the groundwork for lasting change. But political analysts warn that public perception, once soured, is notoriously difficult to reverse. If Labour cannot deliver tangible improvements soon, it risks losing the trust of an already sceptical electorate. Farage, on the other hand, is playing the long game. His strategy is to consolidate support among disillusioned voters, exploit Labour's missteps, and position himself as the voice of a forgotten Britain. Farage's resurgence is a stark reminder that populism thrives in times of discontent. For Labour, the challenge is not just to beat Farage, but to reconnect with an electorate that feels increasingly alienated from traditional politics. The stakes could not be higher. Starmer's ability to navigate this turbulent period will determine not just the future of his leadership, but the fate of the Labour Party itself. Farage's comeback, meanwhile, represents an extraordinary opportunity to reshape Britain's political landscape and cement his place as one of its most influential figures. The battle for Britain's political future is already underway, and the stakes are enormous. Labour's scandals, missteps and faltering narrative have created fertile ground for Farage's resurgence. Starmer's government faces a daunting road ahead, where every decision could tip the balance between recovery and collapse. Farage, ever the disruptor, is ready to capitalise on every stumble. The outcome of this high-stakes contest will shape the course of British politics for years to come.